Hello, welcome to the channel. Here I tell stories of real people, sometimes sad, sometimes heartbreaking, but so real.
My husband told me not to come to his parents' house for Easter because his ex-wife would be there, and I spent the morning packing my children's overnight bags like I was preparing them for a sleepover instead of an exile, folding Maya's pink rabbit pajamas with the careful, mechanical precision of a woman who had already decided that obedience was cheaper than dignity, but more expensive than she could afford to keep paying. And the sound of the zipper closing on Luca's small dinosaur suitcase was the loudest thing I had heard in 7 years of marriage, because it was the sound of my own erasure being made official, packaged, made neat enough to be carried out the door by my sister while I stayed behind to clean up the crumbs of a life that had never been mine to begin with. Daniel said it on Saturday night, over the remains of a pot roast I had started at noon, because his mother liked her carrots caramelized and her meat falling apart, as if tenderness in food could compensate for the brittleness in her love, as if the hours I had spent basting and braising and making sure the gravy did not lump could be traded for a seat at a table where my chair had never existed except as a temporary fixture. A folding chair brought out for overflow guests and put back in the closet the moment the real family arrived. He didn't look up when he said it. He was cutting his meat into perfect squares, the knife making that thin, expensive sound against the china we had registered for 7 years ago at Bloomingdale's in New Haven, back when I still believed that matching dishware meant matching futures. And the light from the pendant lamp above the table fell across his hands in a way that made me notice how his knuckles had begun to loosen with age, how the skin there looked like paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times, and I thought, absurdly, of my father's hands after my mother died, how they had seemed to shrink inside his own skin, as if grief were a solvent that dissolved the scaffolding of a man from the inside out. And I wondered if Daniel was dissolving too, if the man I had married was already gone, and I had been too busy making pot roast to notice the empty space where he used to be. "Mom called," he said, and the way he said it was not an opening but a verdict, the word mom landing between us like a gavel made of something soft and rotting, something that left a stain on the air that no amount of fresh flowers or scented candles could cover. Emily is driving up from Stamford with Kira and Jason. Mom wants all the grandchildren together for the photo. You know how she is about the Easter photo. I knew. I knew exactly how Virginia Whitmore was about the Easter photo, how she had the same photographer come to the house on Linden Street every year since 1987, how the mantel in her drawing room was a timeline of other people's intact families, Daniel and Emily in the center for 12 consecutive springs, Kira's baby teeth giving way to braces, giving way to a Yale sweatshirt, Jason growing from a frog-legged toddler into a boy who looked more like his father every year. And then the gap, the 2 years of absence after the divorce, and then the resumption because Virginia had decided that the family was not broken, merely reconfigured, and the new wife was a detail she refused to photograph, like a blemish she could airbrush out by simply not inviting her. And I had known this for years, had seen the way my name was omitted from the Christmas card list, had watched Virginia introduce me at parties as Daniel's friend for the first 2 years of our marriage, but knowing and hearing it spoken aloud over the remains of a dinner I had cooked were different kinds of knowledge. The difference between suspecting a wound and watching it open. "She thinks it's best if you stay here with Maya and Luca," Daniel said, and he finally looked up, his eyes the same gray-green they had been when I met him at a gallery opening in Soho, when he had been wearing a navy blazer that smelled like cedar and rain, and he had told me, with a laugh that made my ribs ache, that family law was just a fancy way of watching love die in slow motion and charging by the hour. I had thought then that his cynicism was armor. I had not understood that it was a diagnosis. "Best for who?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, too high, too thin, like a wire stretched between two poles that were moving further apart. And I realized that I had not asked a question like that in years, that I had trained myself out of curiosity, out of the dangerous habit of wanting to know why things were the way they were, and the sound of my own question frightened me more than his answer, because it meant that some part of me was still alive, still capable of wanting, still dangerous. Best for the kids, he said, and he said it gently, the way he said everything now, as if I were a client he was trying to keep calm before a deposition, as if our marriage were a case he was managing rather than a life he was living, and I watched his jaw work beneath the skin, that small tick he got when he was negotiating something he had already decided was non-negotiable. And I thought about the last time he had touched me with something other than convenience, the night Maya was born, when he had held my hand in the delivery room and cried and said he had never loved anyone the way he loved me. And I wondered if that man was still in there somewhere, buried under the layers of precedent and strategy, and the endless, exhausting work of maintaining two families without fully belonging to either. Kira's been struggling at Yale, homesick. Mom thinks a full house, the old traditions. It'll ground her. And Jason. You know how teenage boys are. He needs his father around men. Real men. Not. He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at the sink full of dishes I had not yet washed, at the refrigerator covered in Maya's drawings of our family, 4 stick figures holding hands under a sun that looked like a fried egg, and I followed his gesture with my eyes, seeing the room as he must see it, as a collection of obligations, of sticky fingerprints and half-finished art projects, and the evidence of a domesticity that bored him, that had always bored him, that he had entered like a man checking into a hotel he did not plan to stay in long. "Not what?" I said, and the words came out sharper than I intended. Sharp enough to make him look at me with something that might have been surprise or might have been irritation. The look of a man who was not used to being asked to finish his sentences. "Not a situation," he finished, and he reached across the table to touch my hand, his fingers warm and dry and utterly foreign, the fingers of a man who had not touched me with desire in months, but with increasing frequency touched me with reassurance, as if he were patting a dog that had begun to whine too loudly, as if my unhappiness were a behavioral issue that could be corrected with the right tone of voice and a firm hand. I looked at his hand on mine. The wedding band was still there, a thin platinum circle that had cost $3,000 and now felt like a collar I had grown into so gradually I no longer noticed the weight until someone tightened it, and I thought about the day he had put it on my finger, how the sun had come through the chapel window in a slant of gold that made everything look holy. How I had believed that the ring was a beginning when it had really been a kind of ending, a closing of doors, a settling for less than I deserved because I was 30 and he was successful. And I had been taught that a man who did not hit you and did not drink and did not gamble was a man you should be grateful for, even if he looked through you like you were glass. "And Maya and Luca?" I asked, and my voice was steady now. The steadiness of a woman who had already decided to let go and was just waiting for her fingers to agree. "You'll have your own little Easter here," he said, and he smiled, that smile that had once made me feel chosen, special, the one woman who could heal the damage Emily had done, the smile that now made me feel like a placeholder, a bookmark left in a novel he had already finished reading but kept on the shelf for appearance's sake. "Just the 3 of you. Pancakes. That bunny movie they like. It'll be nice. Quiet. Quiet." The word echoed in the kitchen, which was not quiet at all because the refrigerator was humming and the faucet was dripping, and somewhere upstairs Maya was talking in her sleep, A soft, urgent murmur that sounded like she was already arguing with someone in her dreams, already learning the language of exclusion, already practicing the silence that would be required of her if she wanted to survive in a family where women were expected to disappear on command. And I thought about my own mother, who had spent 30 years disappearing into my father's ambitions, who had died of a cancer that I was sure had started in the place where her voice used to be. And I thought about the inheritance of silence, how it passed from mother to daughter like a silver tray that was beautiful and heavy and useless for anything except carrying other people's needs. Okay, I said. I said okay because I was 36, and I had been married to Daniel Whitmore for 7 years, and I had learned that okay was the only currency that bought me peace, that resistance was a luxury for women who had somewhere else to go, and I had given up my apartment in New Haven when Maya was born, had let my freelance editing clients drift away until only 3 remained, had become a woman whose address was her husband's house, and whose name was his name, and whose Sundays were whatever he decided they were. And the word okay felt like a stone in my mouth, smooth and heavy, and already beginning to sink. Thank you, he said, and he squeezed my hand once, twice, the rhythm of a man closing a deal, the rhythm of a lawyer who had just secured a settlement he knew was unfair but legally sound. I knew you'd understand. You're you're good at understanding. That's what I love about you. Love. He said it the way he might say he loved a comfortable chair, a reliable car, a sweater that did not itch. And I sat at the table after he went upstairs to pack his overnight bag, to lay out the blue shirt his mother liked, the tie with the tiny eggs on it that Virginia had given him 3 Easters ago as a joke that was not a joke. And I listened to the house settle around me, the old wood groaning in the March wind, the sound of Daniel's footsteps overhead, the weight of him moving through rooms that were technically half mine but had never felt like anything other than borrowed space. And I thought about the first Easter I had spent with him, 5 months after we met, when he had brought me to this same house, and Virginia had looked at me over the rim of her champagne flute and said, "You're the editor, yes? How lovely. Daniel always did need someone to correct his grammar." And I had laughed because I was 29 and in love, and I thought that if I was charming enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, I could earn my way into a family that had already decided I was a footnote. I thought about the way Emily's name lived in this house like a ghost that had never been exorcised, the way Virginia still kept her wedding photo in the hallway, the way Kira called me Claire but called her Mom, the way Jason looked through me at dinner parties as if I were a window he was waiting to open, and I thought about Maya, who was 6 and already learning to smooth her dress before she sat down, already watching her father's face for signs of approval, and Luca, who was 4, and still believed that love was a physical substance you could hold in your hands, like Play-Doh or sand. And I wondered how long it would take for him to learn that love was actually a vapor, something you could see but never keep, something that disappeared the moment you tried to grasp it. I went upstairs. Daniel was asleep, or pretending to be, his breathing deep and regular in the dark, and I stood at the window looking out at the street, at the other houses in our Guilford neighborhood with their porch lights still on, their Easter wreaths hanging like promises nobody intended to keep. And I thought about the hotel on the Boston Post Road, the one with the view of St. Mary's steeple, the one I had driven past 100 times thinking who stays there, who comes to a town like this and pays to sleep in a room that smells like other people's loneliness. And I thought about it until the thought became a plan, and the plan became a certainty. And then I was moving through the dark house with the silent efficiency of a thief, packing Maya's bunny pajamas and Luca's stuffed lamb and their toothbrushes, writing a note to Daniel that said Sarah's taking them for the night so I can rest, which was not a lie because Sarah would take them, and I would rest, just not in the way he imagined, not in the way that anyone in this house would recognize as rest. I called my sister at 6 in the morning, while the sky was still that color of gray that made everything look like a photograph before the developer fixes it, and she answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep and suspicion. "Claire, I need you to take the kids today," I said, and my voice was steady, calmer than I felt, the voice of a woman who had already stepped off the cliff and was calling back instructions on how to fly. "Today, it's Easter. We're going to Tom's parents in—" "Please, Sarah, just until tonight. I'll explain later." There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant she was sitting up in bed, pushing Tom's arm off her shoulder, turning on the lamp in the guest room where she probably thought I couldn't hear the worry. "Claire, what did he do?" "Nothing," I said, and it was true. Nothing was exactly what he had done. Nothing and everything. The nothing of erasure. The everything of 1,000 small exclusions that had accumulated like plaque in an artery until the whole system was ready to rupture. He asked me to stay home. So Emily could be there, so the photo would look right. Sarah exhaled, a long, sharp sound like a tire losing air. "That son of a bitch." "Don't," I said, though I didn't know what I was asking her not to do, not to name it or not to make it real, and I heard her moving, the creak of her floorboards, the sound of her robe being cinched. "I'll be there in an hour," she said. "Don't wake them yet. Let them sleep. I'll leave the bags by the door." "Claire, where are you going?" I looked at the duffel bag on the bed, the small suitcase with the broken zipper I kept meaning to replace, the bottle of wine I had taken from the rack in the basement, the one Daniel had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. "Nowhere," I said. "Everywhere," I thought, but I did not say it. Sarah arrived at 7:30, her hair still wet from the shower, her eyes scanning my face with the clinical intensity of a woman who had watched our mother die of silence, of the cancer that grew in the space where words should have been, and she hugged me too hard, too long, the way she had hugged me at Mom's funeral, as if she could hold me together by force. "Mommy?" Maya stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair a tangled halo, and I knelt down to her level, my knees cracking in the quiet hallway, and I smelled her sleep-warm skin, the particular scent of her that was part Johnson's shampoo and part something uniquely Maya, a smell that made my chest contract with a violence that felt like it could break ribs, and I thought about the biology of love, how the body remembered what the mind tried to forget, how my cells knew her better than I knew myself. "Baby, Aunt Sarah's going to take you and Luca on a special Easter adventure," I said, and my voice only wavered on the word Easter, which suddenly seemed like the most obscene word in the English language, a word that meant resurrection and renewal and all the things that were being denied to me in my own home. "Are you coming?" she asked, and her eyes were so brown, so like Daniel's, that looking into them felt like looking into a mirror that showed me everything I had failed to become. "I have work," I said, and the lie tasted like copper, like blood from a bitten cheek. "But it's Easter," Luca said from behind her, his voice smaller, younger, still carrying the absolute conviction that holidays were laws of physics, immutable and sacred. And I wanted to tell him that nothing was sacred, that the world was a machine that chewed up mothers and spit out photographs. But I smiled instead, the smile of a woman who had learned that her children's innocence was more important than her own truth. "I know, baby. I'll see you tonight, I promise." I kissed their foreheads. I smoothed Maya's hair. I helped Luca find his shoes, and I watched Sarah load them into her Subaru with the car seats she kept for emergencies. And I waved until they turned the corner, and I could no longer see Luca's small hand pressed against the window. And then I stood on the porch in my robe, and I realized that the street was empty, that everyone was inside with their families, that the world was proceeding with its rituals while I was being excised from mine, and the cold air on my face felt like the first honest thing I had felt in years. I went inside. I showered. I put on the black dress I had bought for a funeral 2 years ago, the one Daniel had said was too severe, and I applied mascara with a hand that only shook a little, and I drove to the Shoreline Inn with the windows down even though it was 42 degrees and the wind smelled like Long Island Sound and thawing mud, and I checked in under my maiden name, Clark, which the clerk wrote without looking up, and I took the key for room 217 because it was the only one with a view of Linden Street. And I climbed the stairs that smelled like cigarettes and lemon disinfectant, and the particular melancholy of highway motels that exist in the liminal space between where people are and where they want to be. The room was small. The bed was made with a polyester coverlet the color of institutional peas, and the window looked out over the parking lot and, beyond it, the steeple of St. Mary's, and the tree-lined avenue that led to Virginia Whitmore's house. The house I had decorated for Christmas, had endured Thanksgiving in, had tried to make myself small enough to fit into, and I sat in the armchair by the window and I waited for the shame to come. The shame of being a woman in a motel room on Easter Sunday, the shame of having nowhere else to go, but the shame did not come, and in its absence I felt something else. Something frightening and vast and unmistakably like freedom. It was 9:15. At 10, the Whitmores would be leaving for church. Virginia in her mink that was older than I was, Daniel in his blue suit, Emily in whatever she wore that made her look like the woman who had never stopped belonging there. And I opened the wine. I did not have a corkscrew, so I pushed the cork into the bottle with the handle of my hairbrush, and the wine splashed onto the carpet. A dark stain that looked like something dying, and I drank from the bottle because there were no glasses, and it was cheap Cabernet, the kind Daniel bought for clients he did not respect, and it tasted like regret, and blackberries, and the inside of a purse that had not been cleaned in years. I watched the street. I watched the neighbors leave for Mass, the Higgins with their 3 children in matching outfits, the elderly Mr. Castellano walking alone with his cane that tapped a rhythm on the sidewalk like a metronome measuring out the last movements of a life, and then I saw them. They came out of the house at 10:40, right on schedule, Virginia first, her white hair arranged in the helmet she called a style, and then Daniel, and then Emily, and my breath stopped because I had not expected the physical impact of seeing them together, the way their bodies still knew each other's rhythms, the way Daniel's hand went automatically to the small of her back as she navigated the step he had told me 100 times to be careful of. The step I had tripped on last Thanksgiving while carrying a pie. The step he had laughed about later, saying, "Claire, you're such a disaster," said with the tone of affection that was really contempt wrapped in a smile. And I felt the wine turn to acid in my stomach, felt the years of my marriage compress into a single, suffocating moment of clarity. Kira followed, tall and beautiful in a way that made me feel like a pencil sketch next to an oil painting, her dark hair loose down her back, and Jason beside her, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders already carrying the hunched tension of a boy who had learned that the world was a courtroom and his father was always the judge. And they walked to church together. They looked like a family. They looked like the family I had been told I was not needed for, and the wine turned sour in my stomach. And I thought about the note I had left, the lie I had told. And I wondered if Daniel had even noticed I was gone, if he had read the note and felt relief. If he had told Emily, "She's not coming. She never fights for anything." And I wondered if that was true, if my compliance had been mistaken for absence of feeling, if my silence had been read as consent rather than survival. I drank more. The sun moved across the sky, and the room grew warm, and I took off the black dress and sat in my slip, the nylon sticking to my thighs, and I watched the house, watched the cars return, watched the caterers arrive with the ham and the scalloped potatoes, and the rolls that Virginia ordered from the bakery on Chapel Street, because she did not trust my cooking, had never trusted it, had once said to Emily in my hearing, "Claire tries so hard, bless her heart," which in the dialect of Southern women transplanted to Connecticut meant she is inadequate and always will be. And I thought about the time I had brought a homemade cake to Virginia's birthday, and she had cut it with the expression of a woman dissecting a frog, how she had taken one bite and set the fork down and said, "Interesting texture." And Daniel had not defended me, had not said my wife is a wonderful cook, had simply changed the subject to the stock market, and I had smiled and cleared the plates and told myself that next time I would do better, that if I just tried hard enough, I could earn a place at a table that had been built without me in mind. The afternoon passed in a blur of wine and sunlight, and the sound of church bells that rang every hour, each chime a small knife turning in the wound of my exclusion, and I thought about calling, about walking over there, about standing in the doorway and saying, "I am here, I exist, I am his wife," but the words felt ridiculous in my mouth, like a child insisting on a fairy tale after the lights had come on. And I thought about the first time I had met Emily, at Kira's high school graduation, how she had hugged me with the perfect pressure of a woman who knew she had already won, how she had said, "I'm so glad Daniel found someone to help him raise the children," and I had thanked her because I did not know what else to do, because my education in manners had not included a course in recognizing condescension and spitting it back where it belonged. By 6, the light was turning gold, the kind of light that makes everything look nostalgic even when it is painful, and I saw Kira and Jason on the porch, smoking cigarettes they thought nobody knew about, and I saw Daniel through the dining room window laughing, his head thrown back, his hand on Emily's shoulder, and I saw Virginia raise her glass, and I knew they were toasting to family, to continuity, to the persistence of blood over law. And I was not even a ghost at that table. I was less than a ghost. I was an erasure, a correction, a woman who had been asked to stay home and had obeyed so thoroughly she had disappeared. And the wine was gone, and my head was pounding, and the room smelled like my own sweat, and the ghost of 100 other people's disappointments. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, which was stippled with a texture that looked like frozen waves, and I thought about the first time Daniel had hit me, not with his hand, but with his words. The night I had miscarried our first pregnancy, and he had said, "It's probably for the best. We weren't ready." And I had nodded because I was bleeding and he was tired, and I thought that love meant accepting the version of yourself that other people needed you to be, even if that version was smaller, quieter, less real. And I thought about the second time, the night I had found the emails to Emily, not romantic, worse than romantic, administrative, the way he managed her life from a distance, the way he paid her credit card bills and arranged her dental appointments and remembered her mother's birthday while forgetting mine. And I had confronted him and he had said, "She's the mother of my children. Claire, what do you want me to do? Abandon them?" And I had said no because I thought that was the right answer, the noble answer, the answer that would make him see me as good, as worthy, as the kind of woman who could be trusted with his heart. But he had never given me his heart. He had given me his schedule, his needs, his convenience, and I had mistaken those things for intimacy, had built a life on the shifting sand of his attention, and now the tide was coming in, and I was realizing that the castle had never been real, that the flags I had planted were just sticks I had found on the beach. And the room grew dark, and I did not turn on the lamp, and I lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the motel, the couple arguing in 214, the ice machine grinding in the hall, the distant sound of the highway that led to New York, to Boston, to anywhere but here. My phone was on the nightstand. It was 11:40. Soon it would be Monday, and the holiday would be over, and Daniel would come home and tell me about the dinner, about how nice it was, about how Kira had asked about me, a lie that would make him feel generous, and I would nod and make coffee, and we would resume the performance of our marriage, the long-running play in which I was an understudy who had never been given the script. And I thought about the years ahead, the decades of being the woman who stayed home, who made herself convenient, who aged out of relevance while Daniel remained eternally the center of a family that had never required my presence to feel complete. The phone rang at 11:58. The screen lit up in the dark, a blue-white glare that hurt my eyes, and I saw the name, and I felt my stomach drop because it was not Daniel, it was not Sarah, it was Kira, and Kira never called me. Kira sent polite texts when she needed something. Kira called me Claire in the same tone she might say, "Excuse me," to a stranger on a bus. I answered, "Claire." Her voice was broken, shattered into pieces so small I could hear the gaps between them, the spaces where breath should have been. "Kira, what's wrong? Where are you?" she asked, and there was something in the question that was not accusation but desperation, a need to know that I was real, that I existed somewhere in the world, that the woman her father had erased was still a physical fact. I'm in town," I said, which was true and not true, the kind of answer Daniel had taught me to give. The half-truth that was worse than a lie because it pretended to honesty. "You need to come," she said, and I heard noise behind her, the metallic sounds of a hospital, the paging system, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, and my body knew before my mind did, my skin prickling with the electric certainty of disaster. "Kira, what happened?" "It's Dad," she said, and her voice cracked on the word, broke open like an egg, and I could hear her trying to hold it together, trying to be the good girl she had always been, the girl who did not make scenes, who understood that her father's needs came first. He collapsed. After dinner. We thought he was joking. He made this sound, this noise, and then he was on the floor and Grandma was screaming and Mom, Emily, she was trying to do CPR but she was crying too hard, and Jason called 911 and they took him to St. Luke's, and I don't know. I don't know if he's going to. Is he alive? I asked, and my voice was a stranger's, flat and sharp. The voice of a woman who had spent years preparing for emergencies she could not name. "He's in the ICU, Kira said. "They said it's a stroke. A bad one." "Claire, where are you? You need to be here. Grandma's. She's not okay. And Mom? Emily. She keeps saying she can't do this. She can't be here. She has a life. She has a husband. And Jason won't talk to anyone, and I'm standing in this hallway and I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "I'm coming," I said, and I was already moving, pulling the black dress over my slip, stepping into shoes I did not remember taking off, grabbing my keys with a hand that had stopped shaking because shock is a kind of anesthesia, a mercy the body grants when the mind cannot process the weight of what is happening. "Kira, listen to me. I'm 5 minutes away. You stay there. You breathe. I'm coming." I hung up. I ran down the stairs, past the night clerk who looked up from his phone with the mild curiosity of a man who had seen too many emergencies to be surprised by any of them, and I got into my car, and I drove through the streets of Guilford with the windows still down, the cold air slapping my face like hands trying to wake me from a sleep I had not known I was in. And I passed the church where they had been that morning, the church where I had been married to Daniel in a small ceremony Virginia had called intimate, but meant inadequate, and I thought about the vows I had made, the promises to have and to hold, and I realized that I had been holding nothing, that my hands had been empty for years and I had only just now noticed. St. Luke's was lit up like a ship in the dark, the emergency room a maw of fluorescent light and antiseptic smell, and I parked illegally and I ran, my heels clicking on the pavement with a sound like gunfire, and I burst through the doors and there they were, assembled in the waiting room like a jury that had already reached its verdict. Virginia sat in the corner, her rosary moving through her fingers with the mechanical rhythm of a woman who believed that prayer was a transaction, that enough Hail Marys could buy her son back from the edge of whatever abyss he had fallen into, and she looked up when I entered and her eyes were red-rimmed and furious, the eyes of a woman who had already decided that my absence was the cause of her son's collapse, that my disobedience had finally manifested as divine punishment. Emily sat beside her face pale and perfect, her makeup unsmudged, her hands clasped in her lap like a statue of grief that had been posed by a photographer. And she looked up when I entered, and her eyes were blank, empty of everything except the shock of a woman who had been asked to play a role she had not rehearsed, and I saw that she was wearing the same dress she had worn to church that morning, the ivory dress that made her look like the first wife, the real wife, the woman who had never needed to be asked to stay home because she had never been invited to leave. Jason stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders shaking in a way that meant he was crying but did not want anyone to see. And Kira saw me first. She was standing by the coffee machine, a styrofoam cup in her hand, and when she saw me, she dropped the cup, and it fell to the floor with a sound that was not loud but seemed to silence everything else, and she crossed the room in 3 strides and she grabbed my arms, her fingers digging into the flesh above my elbows with a strength that surprised me, a strength that spoke of hours of yoga and tennis and the particular fury of a girl who had been told her whole life that she was strong enough to handle anything. "You came," she said, and her voice was raw, stripped of the politeness she usually wore like armor. "You actually came." "Of course I came," I said, and I looked around the room, at the faces that turned to me with expressions ranging from relief to resentment, and I felt the old weight settle on my shoulders, the weight of being the one who showed up, who cleaned up, who made it okay, even when it was not my mess to fix. "Where were you?" Virginia asked, and her voice was a blade, sharp and thin. "Daniel said you were staying home. He said you had work. He said—" "I was in town," I said, and the words were automatic, defensive, the reflex of a woman who had spent years justifying her own existence. "I was nearby." "Nearby," Emily repeated, and she said it the way she might say a word in a foreign language she did not quite understand, and she stood up, smoothing her dress, and I saw that her hands were trembling, the perfect composure cracking at the edges, and she stepped toward me, and I smelled her perfume, something French and expensive that Daniel had once told me he loved, back when we were first dating, and he still talked about her with the casual cruelty of a man who did not realize that every comparison was a cut. "Claire," she said, and she stepped toward me, and I smelled her perfume, something French and expensive that Daniel had once told me he loved, back when we were first dating, and he still talked about her with the casual cruelty of a man who did not realize that every comparison was a cut. "You weren't home. Daniel said you left. He said you took the children to your sisters and you left. He was upset about it. He said you didn't want to be part of the family." He told me not to come," I said, and my voice was louder than I intended, loud enough to make Jason turn around, loud enough to make the nurse at the desk look up, loud enough to break the spell of the waiting room, the polite fiction that we were all here together because we loved the same man. "He told me to stay home," so you could have a proper Easter, so the photo would look right. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence that had texture and weight, and I saw something flicker in Emily's eyes, something that might have been understanding or might have been pity, and I saw Virginia's mouth tighten, and I saw Kira let go of my arms and step back, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the tectonic plates of my marriage grinding against each other with a sound I could feel in my teeth. "That's not true," Virginia said, but her voice lacked conviction, the automatic denial of a mother who had never believed her son capable of cruelty, only of weakness, and weakness was forgivable because it was familiar. "Daniel would never—" "He did," I said, and I was shaking now, not from cold but from the release of something that had been compressed for years, a spring that had finally been allowed to uncoil. "He did," and I said, "Okay," because that's what I do. I say okay. I stay home. I make myself small. I disappear so that everyone else can be comfortable. And I told myself it was love. I told myself it was sacrifice. But it wasn't. It was just fear. It was just the terror of being left alone. And now he's in there. And I don't know if he's going to live or die. And I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, because I've spent so long not feeling anything that I can't tell if I'm sad or if I'm just empty. I stopped. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I realized that I had said too much, that I had violated the code of the waiting room, which was to be stoic, to be supportive, to wait in silence for the doctors to deliver their verdicts, and I felt the eyes on me, the judgment, the confirmation that I was the problem, the disruption, the woman who could not even keep her grief polite. Kira was staring at me. Her face was wet with tears she had not bothered to wipe away, and her mouth was slightly open, and she looked young, suddenly, not the sophisticated college student, but a child who had walked into a room where adults were fighting and did not know where to stand. "You were at the Shoreline Inn," she said, and it was not a question. "I saw you. This morning. I was walking back from the pharmacy. Grandma needed her pills, and I looked up and I saw you in the window. Room 217. You were in your slip. You were drinking from a bottle." The room seemed to tilt, the floor becoming a slope I could not find my footing on, and I looked at Kira, and I saw that she was not accusing me. She was offering me something, a piece of information that was also a lifeline, a witness to my existence on a day when I had been determined to be invisible. "You saw me," I repeated, and the words came out as a whisper, a prayer. "I saw you," Kira said. "I didn't tell him. I thought you were leaving. I thought you were packing your things and you were going to disappear, and I was glad. I was glad because I thought maybe then he would stop talking about you like you were a burden, like you were something he had to manage, and I hated myself for being glad, but I was. I was so glad. And now he's in there, and I don't know if I'm glad anymore. And I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, and I'm so tired of knowing what I'm supposed to feel." She broke. She put her face in her hands and she sobbed, the kind of sobs that come from a place deeper than tears, the place where children store the anger they are not allowed to express. And I reached for her. I pulled her into my arms, and she came. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, her body shaking with the force of a grief that was too large for her frame, and I held her. I held her the way I had never been allowed to hold her, the way I had wanted to hold her since she was 12, and I had met her, and she had looked at me with eyes that said, "You will never be my mother," and I had agreed. I had agreed because I thought that was the price of admission, the cost of loving a man who came with children who did not want me. "I'm sorry," I whispered into her hair, and I did not know what I was apologizing for seeing her, for being seen, for existing in the space between her parents, for all the ways I had failed and all the ways I had tried. I'm so sorry. The doctor came at 12:15. He was a young man, Indian, with kind eyes and a name tag that said Dr. Patel, and he looked at our assembled group with the professional neutrality of a man who had learned not to invest emotionally in the outcomes of strangers. "Mr. Whitmore is stable," he said, and the room exhaled, a collective breath that seemed to lower the temperature by degrees. "He suffered a hemorrhagic stroke. We've stopped the bleeding, but there's swelling in the brain. We won't know the extent of the damage until he wakes up. It could be hours. It could be days." "Can we see him?" Virginia asked, and her voice was small, stripped of its usual authority, the voice of a mother who had been reminded that her children were mortal. "One at a time," Dr. Patel said. "And he needs rest. No stress. No arguments. His blood pressure is still very high." He looked at me when he said it, a glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long, and I wondered what he saw, what any man would see, looking at this group of women bound together by a man who was not there, a man who had tried to hold two families and had ended up holding neither. Emily went in first. She was gone for 20 minutes, and when she came out, her eyes were red, but her composure was intact, the mask of the woman who had been trained from birth to endure. And she looked at me and she said, "He's asking for you." And there was something in her voice that I could not read, something that might have been resignation or might have been relief. I walked down the hall. The ICU was a landscape of machines and shadows, the beeping of monitors creating a rhythm that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat. And I found his room, 304, and I stood in the doorway, and I looked at him. Daniel. He was pale, so pale he seemed to blend into the sheets, and his head was wrapped in bandages, and tubes ran into his arms and his nose, and he looked small, diminished, the way powerful men always look when their bodies betray them, and I felt a wave of something that was not love and was not hate, but was something in between, a vast gray country where I had been living for years without knowing its name. I sat in the chair beside the bed. I took his hand. It was warm, alive, and I remembered the first time he had held my hand in public, at a restaurant in the village, how he had squeezed my fingers and said, "You're mine now," and I had felt claimed, chosen, how I had not understood that ownership was not the same as love. His eyes opened. They were cloudy, unfocused, and they found my face with the slow deliberation of a man swimming up from deep water. "Claire," he said, and his voice was slurred, thick, the voice of a stranger wearing my husband's face. "I'm here," I said, and I squeezed his hand, and I waited for the gratitude, the relief, the acknowledgement that I had come, that I had shown up, that I was the one sitting beside him while the others waited outside. "Why?" he said, and he swallowed, a painful movement that made the monitors beep faster. "Why did you do this to me?" I felt the words like a physical blow, a fist to the sternum that knocked the air from my lungs, and I stared at him, at his face, which was contorted not with pain, but with accusation, with the absolute certainty that I was the architect of his suffering. "Do what?" I asked, and my voice was barely audible, a thread of sound in the mechanical symphony of the ICU. "You left," he said, and his hand tightened on mine with a strength that surprised me, the strength of a man who was fighting not for his life, but for his narrative. "You left me, with them, alone. You knew I couldn't, and you left." "Daniel," I said, and I was shaking again, shaking so hard the chair rattled against the floor. "I didn't leave. You told me to stay home. You told me not to come. You should have fought," he said, and his eyes were closing, the effort of speech too much, but his mouth kept moving, kept forming the words that cut me more cleanly than any knife. You should have known. A wife knows. You let me go alone. You let me fall. His hand went slack. His eyes closed. The monitors continued their beeping, but he was gone, back down into the dark. And I sat there with his hand in mine, and I realized that he had not been talking about the stroke. He had been talking about everything, about the years of my compliance, my accommodation, my endless, exhausting yes, and he had interpreted my silence not as love, but as abandonment, had convinced himself that my obedience was a kind of cruelty, a refusal to fight for him that justified his own refusal to fight for me. I stood up. I laid his hand on the sheet, and I walked out of the room, and I closed the door behind me with a click that sounded like the end of something, a period placed at the end of a sentence that had been running on for 7 years. The hallway was empty. The others had gone to the cafeteria, or home, or somewhere else, and I was alone in the fluorescent light, alone with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of my own breathing. And I walked to the elevator and I pressed the button and I waited. And when the doors opened, I stepped inside and I pressed G for ground, and I did not look back. The parking lot was wet. It had rained while I was inside, a spring rain that smelled like earth and new beginnings. And I walked to my car and I unlocked it, and I sat in the driver's seat and I looked at the hospital, at the window of room 304, and I thought about going back, about being the good wife, the understanding wife, the wife who sat by the bedside of a man who had tried to erase her, and I felt the weight of that role settle on my chest like a stone. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. Maya woke up. She's asking when Daddy's coming home. What should I tell her? I stared at the screen. The letters blurred, became shapes, became the map of a life I no longer recognized, and I thought about Maya, about her brown eyes and her questions, and the way she was already learning to make herself small, already watching her father's face for permission to exist, and I thought about Luca, who still believed that love was something you could hold in your hands. I thought about Kira, who had seen me, who had chosen to tell me, who had offered me the strange, bitter gift of witness. I thought about Daniel, who would wake up tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, and who would need someone to feed him and bathe him and forgive him. And I knew that the world would expect that someone to be me, the wife, the woman who had been trained from birth to absorb the blows of men and call it strength. The rain tapped against the windshield. The wipers moved back and forth, clearing the glass only for it to blur again, and I thought about the hotel room, about the bottle of wine and the black dress and the view of a family that had looked complete without me, and I thought about the word exile, how I had used it that morning without understanding what it meant, how exile was not a place but a condition, a way of being in the world that no amount of obedience could cure. I started the car. I did not drive home. I drove to Sarah's house, to the place where my children were sleeping, and I would wake them up, and I would hold them, and I would tell them the truth, or as much of the truth as they could bear, and I would not promise them that everything would be okay, because I was done with promises, done with the easy lies that kept the machinery running, done with being the woman who stayed home so that other people could be comfortable. The road was empty. The streetlights made pools of yellow light on the wet asphalt, and I drove through them one by one, each one a small baptism, a moment of illumination followed by darkness. And I thought about Easter, about resurrection, about the myth that the dead could rise unchanged. And I knew that whatever rose from this night would not be the same, could not be the same. That the woman who had packed her children's bags that morning was already gone, was already someone else, someone I had not yet met but was driving toward with my hands on the wheel and my eyes open. My phone buzzed again. Kira. I'm still here, at the hospital. I told Grandma I was staying. I told her someone should be here when he wakes up. She said I was being dramatic. She took Emily and Jason home. I'm alone. Claire, are you coming back? I pulled over. I stopped the car. I looked at the message, at the question that was not just about tonight, but about everything, about the future, about the shape of a family that had been broken and reconfigured so many times it no longer had a name. And I thought about the girl I had held in the hallway, the girl who had cried on my shoulder. And I thought about the woman I was becoming, the woman who was learning that love was not obedience, and that family was not a photograph on a mantle, but a choice you made every day, sometimes against the weight of everything you had been taught. I typed a reply. My thumbs moved over the glass, slow and deliberate, each letter a small act of courage. I'm not coming back tonight, but I'm not leaving. I'll be here tomorrow, and the day after. Not because he needs me, because I need to know who I am when I'm not invisible. Get some sleep, Kira. I'll see you in the morning. I sent it. I put the phone down. I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw a woman with mascara running down her cheeks, her hair wild from the wind, her eyes wide and frightened and alive, and I did not look away. I started the car again. I drove toward my sister's house, toward my children, toward the beginning of whatever came next, and the rain kept falling, and the night kept going, and somewhere behind me, a man was sleeping in a hospital bed, dreaming of a family he had tried to hold together by pushing away the one person who had been willing to stay, and I did not know if I would forgive him, if I would go back, if I would spend the rest of my life in the gray country between love and survival. But I knew, with a certainty that felt like pain and also like freedom, that I would not disappear again. That I was done being the woman who stayed home. That Easter was over, and whatever rose from the dead would have to rise without my permission, and I would be there to see it. Not as a ghost, not as a footnote, but as a woman who had finally, after 36 years, learned to occupy her own life. The road curved ahead of me, dark and wet and full of possibility, and I drove on.